Hi, good afternoon. It's Dr. Michael McNeil here. Take two. I just tried to do this video and then forgot the name of some important philosophers. I thought, I better go and check those. So I want to talk a bit about analytical philosophy and in a sense, because that's really connected with the background in a sense to my own project, and it's also it's the, in a sense, the dominant philosophical milieu of the 20th century in Anglo-American thought. Generally, that's not completely true, because there's definitely other streams. It's normally contrasted with what you would call Continental philosophy, which again is a very broad. That's a very sort of like broad brush. Just as analytical philosophy is a very broad brush. The term continental philosophy is equally as broad, but continental philosophy is generally associated with the tradition which, in the 20th century at least, you'd have people like you have Heidegger and Sartre. They'll be very much can be considered sort of continental thought, and Lyotard later on, the postmodern, would be thought of developing continental thought. It was originally associated with the continent of Europe, which is why it's got that label continental, but really it's anybody. If you've got like in France, you've got, sorry, in Canada, you've got lots of people that migrated from Europe. So anybody that any places where you've had concentrations of sort of Europeans who migrated, or so it's generally, both schools in many ways are subdivisions of what would even more broadly be called Western philosophy. And then you've got a completely separate block of thought which is associated with, people generally call it Eastern philosophy. And Eastern philosophy, again, it's such a broad term, but most people, perhaps if you wanted to try and generalize it to a degree, is that in the sense the Western tradition was much more rational or empirical, or uses rationality and empiricism. The Eastern tradition, people would say, it's much more intuitional. They would assume that there's a fundamental limitation to reason, and in order to really get in contact with reality, you have to make this sort of intuitive. You just encounter sort of reality, and the way you, in many systems of thought, the way you encounter this reality is to change your consciousness. So whether it's through transcendental meditation, or whether it's through chanting, or whether it's through taking on holy scriptures, or being in particular environments. So in a sense, it's not like a rational, talking about rationality most broadly there, it's not like a rational process. It's almost like there's some element of irrationality in that's how many people would characterize, in very crude terms, sort of like Eastern philosophy, whereas Western philosophy is much more, as again, using R, small r, it's concerned with rationality and the use of rationality. But that is interesting, because when you divide between, say, the continental schools and the what the analytical schools, which I want to concentrate on, some people would say that the continental school in some ways is moving more towards the intuition and the rational. Now the key in a sense, the key to understanding particularly modern analytical philosophy, which is generally associated with the 20th century. There was a revival in analytical philosophy in the very early years of the 20th century, and the philosopher that's most associated with that is somebody called G.E. Moore, and he was in a sense joined in his rebellion against Hegelianism by Bertrand Russell, who's one of the world's most famous philosophers that the world's ever produced, for all sorts of reasons. Very, very influential philosophically. And then in the second part of the 20th century, he died in 1979, but from say 1950 onwards, he became very much associated with social issues and anti-war issues, and he was jailed a couple of times for I think in the First World War he was he was jailed for distributing a leaflet on conscientious objection, and then I think even when he was 90, he was again in jailed for a short time because of he was accused of some sort of incitement to do with nuclear weapons, and so his life he had an enormous number of accolades for his life, but he was probably the most influential philosopher in the first, say, from probably 1930, 1940 onwards till about 1950. His last major work, philosophical work, was published, I think, in around about 1950, and I think it was what was it called? I think it was the Human Knowledge, its limitations, and something like that. That was his last major work where he was in a sense still doing philosophy. He did like a lot of historiography of philosophy afterwards, so he wrote his History of Western Philosophy, although I think he published his first edition in the middle of the 30s, but I think he republished various editions of that, and he did some more sort of work which was more to do with autobiographical stuff and writing about social issues, and he really lost his influence within philosophy sort of probably around the 1950s as a philosopher who was really looked to and developed work. I mean, he expressed frustration, I think, in his autobiography, which I think was written probably in the mid to late 70s. He said he was just surprised that, he said, I just don't understand why people don't think I've got solutions to these problems, but why when I wrote this nothing happened. I've got solutions to these problems, why is nobody taking notice of me? So it's a little bit of a sad story in some ways, but he was very much more known for his social activism in the second half. But he and G.E. Moore were considered those who led the analytic philosophical revolution at the start of the century. Now, the reason why we need to understand that there's always been analytical philosophers, that it seemed to almost entirely disappear as a movement after, you would definitely say people like John Locke and David Hume. You would call them analytical philosophers, and so they're sort of like in the sense that Locke's early on, isn't he? He's probably early 17th century. Sorry, late 17th century. I keep getting confused between if I say 1700s, that might help. And then you've got you've got Kant and Hume as contemporaries. Kant sort of like died in 1800, didn't he? I think. And so you got Hume writing all the way through the 1700s, up until about 1760, didn't he? I think for the last 10 or so years of his life, he said, I want to live remote from all clamour, because he'd been such a controversial figure. So he just basically, and he didn't publish his most controversial works on natural philosophy and natural religion. He waited until after he was dead, and one of his relatives or his son or somebody published the work, because it was considered too incendiary. So it's a really interesting time of thought. Now, I did mention in a previous video that Kant was very much considered the turning point of Western philosophy, and so and Kant obviously sort of published his main works sort of from, say, late 1770. I think 1778 maybe his first edition of the Critique, and then he did his three critiques critique trilogy, and then he in some ways revisited those in the latter parts of his life until he was able. In I think the last couple of years he became so ill and mentally impaired, almost people that he didn't, he couldn't do much significant work in the last couple of years of his life, but he remained pretty active and involved in teaching and communicating with people up until that point. And I think there is quite a poignant story. Somebody goes to visit him just shortly before he sort of like really lost his ability. His dementia became became too bad, and he actually said to them, he said to them, "Sir, I'm still able to appreciate the good and the bad things of life." He said, "I'm not that far gone that I can't still appreciate." But his major work was all. Some of it was published, I think, after some, and there's been some work of Kant's work which has only been published very, very recently. It's like it's Opus Posthumus, I think. It was only done in there. That was, and the whole thing is like, that was him revisiting some of the themes of the critiques, and he'd started to revisit them, I think, in the early 1790s, but had never sort of completed. So this is sort of, there's still Kant scholars who are involved in getting his work so that people can really see how his thought, because people tend to just think of Kant in terms of the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. It's just to do with aesthetics, I think, isn't it? And so they tend to think of him like that, and they don't tend to think, well, there was actually a lot of other work that flowed out of that, in response to people not really understanding his work and criticism of that work. He did have a whole block and body of work which flowed out of that, but his key thought, was he was trying to deal with the problems of rationalism and empiricism, and trying to deal with the skepticism of Hume. He didn't want to get Hume, was just basically destroyed the possibility of knowledge. And so Kant divided reality into the phenomenal realm, which is the realm of science. And so he wanted to save science, he wanted to make it possible that natural science, he was thinking of, when he talks science, he's really thinking of natural science, of observing phenomena, the physics. He was, interesting enough, Kant did quite a lot of work in natural science in his early work. He did quite a lot of physics and optics, and he'd written a couple of treatises early on in his life, so he was somebody that had come, that was the background to his very early work. I think it was in the 1730s, 1740s, and then he'd moved into he'd been, I think, in teaching positions or there, but then he encountered the work of Hume, and it said that Hume had awoken him from his dogmatic slumbers, which is a posh way of saying Hume, intellectually, Hume's skepticism and Kant found alarming, and he wanted to try and answer it in some way. And so his answer, if you can call it an answer, again, this is to call it an answer is a Kant scholars and philosophers will argue forever, I think, over whether Kant ever answered Hume, or whether he just reflected Hume's answer back to him as an answer. Whether he just reflected Hume's, because Hume his conclusion was that causality, if you like, is just a habit of the mind. So causality, which is the basis of, say, natural science, is the basis of induction. You can't, if you think that A causes B, Hume very astutely actually said that, actually all you see is you see a certain sequence of events. You never see causality itself. This thing called causality, which we might want to call a transcendental, that makes your understanding. It's not how Kant would describe, causality. It's like a transcendental, which helps you understand, makes possible understanding. But Hume had basically said, well, if I just proceed on empirical presuppositions, then that there is no such thing as causality. I'm seeing events, and so I'm just seeing. So my knowledge, if you like, or things I call knowledge, are just habits. The habits of causality is purely a habit of my mind. And Kant looked at that and said that that almost destroys the possibility of science. So his solution was to divide reality into what's called the phenomenal realm. So phenomena is the realm of nature, and that's the realm in which we can do science in. So and what's called the noumenal realm. Now the noumenal realm is, he says, that's where you would experience, that's where things exist as things in themselves, but we only experience things as they appear to us. But those are when we're dealing with phenomena, those things are appearing to us in a particular way. But there's no guarantee that we're actually in contact with those things. That's an important distinction to understand in Kant's thoughts. He was saying there's things as they are in themselves, which exist in the noumenal realm, which is beyond our reach. It's beyond the reach of of intellect, of reason, but he did believe that he posited that there was a noumenal realm, and that's the realm of God, that's the realm of ethics, that's the realm of, so that in a sense those are things which are necessary and useful for us as posits. So God's a useful posit to guarantee, if you like, the moral. He had what was called the moral argument for God. In the end, our experience of life is only made sensible if there's God. It's a specific form of argument for God, because he was one of the first to slice and dice the ontological argument and the cosmological and teleological arguments, but he did feel that the concept of God and in a sense that role that God would say play in the moral, in of ensuring that eventually the person who moral and who did their duty, that was thinking that if he was trying to say that injustice could not be like an eternal injustice. At some point there would be a correction, because God would be the one that's guaranteeing the moral fabric of the universe, and that's, in a sense, that's called the sort of like the moral argument. It's whether that argument was successful or not. Many people would say it was not. I mean, particularly in its successes, people would just say the argument failed. I think the book that I recommended in one of my first talks, it's got section. It goes through those arguments, all those different forms of arguments, and then it says the failure of the moral argument. So it says the ontological argument, the failure of the ontological argument. Now that's an opinion whether or not they think they failed, because there is a form of the ontological argument that Alvin Plantinga formulated, where he would say, well, this argument is actually this is a triumphant form of the argument, but equally, I think Alvin Plantinga also said that it was a bit like saying, but we can't make any progress in natural theology, even if this argument is considered a valid form of the argument, because an argument can be valid, but that doesn't mean that it's actually establishing anything, or it's true, or it's proving anything. It's just there's a difference between an argument having a valid form and it actually being like an argument that proves anything true or proves anything about the world. So that's a matter of logic, which I want to get onto today. So that's just sort of like a bit of a historical background to that sort of like flow. The 19th century in particular was a series of reactions to Kant, and some people sort of accepted, said, yeah, reason. They said, yeah, reason's limited. If we really want to know anything about getting to the noumenal realm and experiencing in the world as it is in itself, and particularly in the sense, if you like, the metaphysics of that, because obviously when Kant, not necessarily obviously, but when Kant divided the phenomena, the two realms into phenomenal and noumenal, he said that at noumenal realm we can't know cognitively, we can't know by reason. So it says he'd become like a metaphysical skeptic at that point. He said reality is in itself, we're separated from that. We only experience reality as it appears to us in the phenomenal realm. And so in a sense was metaphysical skeptical, but he wasn't an atheist. That's the thing. Kant was very concerned with the atheism of Hume as well as the philosophy of Hume. He was concerned with the atheism of Hume, and there's quite a lot of interesting work which is less appreciated, I think, in Kant's scholarship, simply because it deals with Kant's attitude to religion, and I think it's one of his most famous. He did a couple of very quite famous books regarding moral philosophy and like prolegonomer to the future metaphysic, and another one that's a little bit harder to get hold of is his Religion Within the Bounds of Reason, which has some fascinating parts of it. There's no doubt about it. Some of his because he was trying to say what when you say religion within the bounds of reason, what's a reasonable religion? It's almost, in some ways, almost like a contradiction of terms that it would be. But he was trying to say, well, but there are some sections of that book. I can remember when I read it for the first time, or at least read sections. I don't think I've read the whole thing through. Any reading of Kant at all, it's a bit like people call it like a rite of passage. If you ever try and read the Critique of Pure Reason, if you get past, say, the introduction and 70 pages in, if you manage to do that, that's, you're in a league of superior philosophers or something. People find it hard because his language is very dense. The sentence structure's contorted. So that's the Continental's flavour. If you read Continental philosophy, you can quickly become bogged down in the language. It can be very technical vocabulary, and so that's why, in a sense, why I want to talk eventually. I'm supposed to be talking about analytic philosophy, but I think that historical stuff is really, really handy, really useful to actually understand that. Kant's considered his turning point, and people came out from Kant. So some people went into the intuitive route, people like Schopenhauer, and who really started to emphasise the subjective. And Schopenhauer was interesting because he took quite a lot of his inspiration from. He'd been involved with Indian philosophy quite a lot. He'd been in contact. I think he'd travelled or something, or been with the German. I don't know if he'd volunteered with the German army, if they'd been in India. There's some interesting thing in Schopenhauer's history. There's people with that who took the more intuitive route, that if you want to get in contact with reality as it really is in itself, i.e. the noumenal, we're going to have to intuit, and we're going to have to so in a sense you're not trying to argue and trying to convince people in the sense with you're just saying. Schopenhauer was quite interesting because he said that if you say the right thing, if you say write a philosophy and you say the right thing and it's right, the people are just going to read my philosophy and they're going to go, wow, yes, he's got it. You're going to have this. It's a bit like when if you write and you're trying to write about something and you're trying to report something or something, and often as a writer you will read what somebody else has said about something, and sometimes you'll read something that somebody else has wrote and you'll go, yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. That I was trying to wrap my words and wrap my language around those concepts, and they've got it. That was it. They've got it. And Schopenhauer was very much of that view. He believed that his philosophy, when people would read it, they would suddenly go, yeah, he's got it. Yeah. So because you can't argue because it's noumenal, it's something over in the noumenal, so you can't get yourself there, but you're expressing, and you find this thought, I think, a bit in Continental philosophy, that I think it's a bit like Lyotard. I tried to quote Lyotard a little bit in my thesis, but one of the examiners said, basically, being polite, he was much more polite than this, but he said you don't really know what you're talking about on this particular when you're trying to talk about postmodern Lyotard's postmodernism. You're not being, because I think I think yes, because I'm far more an analytical philosopher than I am in the Continental school. Yes, so I'm happy to say that yes, I'm not a Continental philosopher, but he said I'd misrepresented Lyotard to a degree. But what I would say, I think I am representing Lyotard accurately here when I say that, because I'm quoting him at this point. Whereas one of Lyotard's quotes was that you are going to be trying to, when you're sort of doing philosophy and you're trying to write, you're trying to describe in language something that's already happened, and how your language, because of the ambiguous nature of language and the lack of clarity, and you're almost like falsifying what you're trying to describe in language. And so in many ways that's sort of like the stream of Continental thought. So people came out from Kant who wanted some sort of intuitive, subjective contact the work of Kierkegaard was very influential in this degree, which sort of out of Kierkegaard and flowed. Sartre basically secularized Kierkegaard, and you had the existentialist movement, and in the early 20th century you also had what was called the phenomenology, which is an interesting movement in itself, because it was trying to return to a view of philosophy which dealt with the big questions, and it wanted to get back in contact with a real world, and I'm trying to remember the name of the most important phenomenologist who I will remember at some point. But what came out of his work, in some ways people said, well, because phenomenology wanted to say there's publicly accessible reasons, there's a publicly accessible world, there's an objective world, there's reasons which are publicly accessible. Whereas existentialism, which came out of phenomenology, Husserl, that was the person I was thinking of. Husserl was who wrote the phenomenology, the big treatise on phenomenology, but the difficulties that they had in making that case, people said, no, actually, there's no public reasons for things. The best things you can come up with for trying to explain the world is to have your own personal. Come to your own personal conclusions, and that's what existentialists were concerned with. It was talking about living authentically. So we, in our 20th century culture, particularly sort of like in the West, and very much in the Anglo-American, we have great sympathy, or when somebody actually says, I might have done it wrong, but I did it with all my heart. They're doing it with all your heart, that authentic, even if somebody's wrong, in scare quotes, even if somebody's later proved wrong or something, if they did it with their best heart intentions, to the best of their ability, we are really prepared to cut them some slack with to say, yeah, that person really, even though say, for me as a young punk in years gone past, Sid Vicious, he lived his life the right way. He only lived until he was about 21, but man, did he have 4 years of, you know what I mean? People will tend to do that. We'll tend to do that with cultural icons, won't we? We even though they might have died very horribly of died of heroin overdose or something, said, yeah, but they lived authentically. And that's, if you like, a bastardization of the existentialist sort of view. You've just got private reasons for your life. That's all you can ever have. You can't have any of these horrible big meta-narratives and these religions and systems that try and tell you the right way to live. You've just got to discover for yourself the right way to live. And that's, in a sense, the continental sort of stream. All that sort of stuff comes out that really, in many ways, is very individualistic. There's no sort of big public answers. By public answer, all I mean by public answer is it's an answer that it's accessible to anybody. It's a bit like saying truth. Truth is what is true for everybody. That's like in many ways the continental school sort of denies that public aspect of truth, or it weakens it, or it tries to. People tend to talk about things like your truths and my truths, and but that's, in a sense, as an analyst, I will say people are that's a nonsensical to say my truth and your truth. That's nonsensical because truth is that which is true for me and true for you. But that's what I'm trying to get to the point of talking about once I get past all this wonderful history. But it's really important to see these themes as they run through, because you can see how this has affected our culture and it's affected our way of looking at life, and that's why I mentioned this, because the philosophies of the 19th century and the philosophies of the 20th century have very dramatically affected our political life and our social political life and our economics, and so it's important to understand what the assumptions of these schools were, And if you understand what the assumptions of schools were and their motivation for doing why they're doing, then you actually understand why we are living in the society that we're living in, which, you know, is one of my motivating themes that I'll return to again and again, is that your philosophical view and where you decide philosophically where you are, that's going to have an enormous influence on the entire rest of your life. And it's so important to tie together, right? This is the metaphysics, this is the metaphysical assumptions, this is the view of the universe these people have got, this is the way they've defined how we know true or false, how we know things, and then that's out of that springs, right, this is the way we should live our life, or the way we believe we should live our life, or this tying together. I return to that sort of theme again and again. Okay, so I think I'll have a short break here, because I found that with the other video, when I let it run, if I just paused it, when it recoded it to publish it, the audio and the video went out of sync. So I'm gonna have a short pause here, have a drink to get my throat, and then I'll try and resume back onto analytical philosophy, where I was trying to get to half an hour ago. Okay, back soon. Hi, Dr. Michael McNeil here. Welcome to part 2 of analytical philosophy. I'll try and actually get into some analytical philosophy now, but I did sort of mention that it's the 20th century is considered the beginning of the 20th century, really considered a revival analytical philosophy. Many people think that analytical philosophy emerged in the 20th century, and that's not true. People like John Locke and David Hume would very much be considered those in the they would be considered analysts, they'd be considered people who have a particular view of reality. And so I think one of the clearest distinctions of, if you want to try and describe the differences, I mentioned in the last video that out of Kant, responses to Kant was where there was like the intuitive route, and then there's what you would call the Hegelian route, which was Hegel said that the problem with reason is that we've got a too primitive view of reason, and what we need is a far more sophisticated model of reason, and then we'll be able to solve the problems of philosophy, if you like, and far better, because we've got a much better model of reason. And if you know anything about Hegelian thought, which is an enormous area in its own right, Hegel, in many ways people would say that if you understand Hegel, then you're just respected. If some people don't believe it's even possible to understand Hegel really fully, and you've got a lot of thought that flows out of Hegel. People, you might say, politically is philosophy. The political implications of philosophy are very interesting, because you get people who Marx's view of history, for example, was basically taken straight from Hegel. The idea that history is flowing towards this ultimate consummation, and so that's if you like the left-wing Hegelians. The right-wing Hegelians, some people would say that the right-wing Hegelians very much to do with conservatism, and it's not so much fascism. That's different, because in many ways fascism and Marxism, that sort of like politics, that extreme left, extreme right. I always find it helpful to think of politics not as left right, but as more as like a circle, and as you go out, you go sort of like to left, right, and then they merge together again. So it's more a matter of which word, the more probably pejoratives that different varieties of fascists chuck at each other. Some people call each other Marxists, some of them, but they're basically, in the way their political philosophy works and how it works out in practice, they're equivalent. It's simply a matter of nomenclature whether you want to call people fascists or communists. Really, they're in their economics and their basic views, they're actually the same. That's for another time. So, but Hegel's view, Hegel, if you know anything about Hegel's sort of basic position, when you hear the words sort of the dialectic, the operation of the dialectic, where you have, say, a thesis, and then there's an antithesis, which is in opposition to us, and then you have some sort of pulling together and reconciliation of those two, and then out from that pops another. So in a sense, the particulars are being pushed together, which was seemingly irreconcilable, but they generate another thesis, and then that another antithesis from somewhere else in nature will combine with these two. And so Hegel's view, and that's probably a very basic view of Hegel, simply because it's really difficult to understand, to describe Hegel simply. But that sort of like idea, if you've ever heard the terms dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and if you consider sort of like Marx's appropriation of that, where he was saying there's this continual battle between in economic terms, there's a battle between, say, the bourgeoisie and the workers, or the elite and the oppressed, and there's this continual struggle and tension, but out of that will emerge some sort of new order. It's that sort of idea. So it's two competing forces, that then there's some synthesis of those, and out of those emerges a new thesis, which is then encounters another antithesis, which then combines. And so Hegel said that reason was far more complicated, and the operations of it were far more complicated. And his Hegelianism, the various forms of Hegelianism, for those who rejected sort of like the intuitive view and wanted somehow to maintain the rational view, they became Hegelians, and Hegel reigned supreme almost until they sort of like the cracks started to appear, perhaps in the mid 1850s, 1860s, in the work of one of the founders of pragmatism, somebody called Peirce, who in many of the things that he would say in his work would be considered far more analytical in breaking complicated problems down into simple components, rather than with Hegel, you're going from the simple components and you're trying to get to a whole, and in Hegel that whole he called it absolute spirit, and it would be like it's when all things are reconciled, all the seemingly distinctions between that we experience in reality, they would all disappear, and it'll be the absolute oneness of everything. And he had like almost like a quasi. He actually considered his philosophy as a updated view of Christian theology. Hard for the people to actually understand that, but he actually said that, well, the Bible and Christian theology was like a low-level expression of my philosophy. My philosophy is the high-level expression of this, and that's why there was an enormous Hegelian cult as well, during the time of his life after, because he was presenting in many ways he was presenting a religious vision, and that, I'm sure that would be an interesting take on Hegel for some people. But his view that eventually everything will come up into come to this place of absolute spirit, and only when everything is known can anything be known. Only when everything is known can any of the relations of reality be properly known. So, which is a dramatic consequence of his way of thinking. So he was saying that you only ever got sort of signposts on the way to reality, a true understanding of reality. You've only got any thesis that you might come up with is going to be tentative until you get to that place of absolute spirit. But the problem is, if you ever got to that place of absolute spirit, all distinctions will be lost, and any individual consciousness would be lost. There would just be one universal consciousness. And when you look at it that way, you see an enormous link with perhaps what you would call the Eastern intuitive view of, it's a bit like the old Beatles song in the 60s when they got involved with the Maharishi in India, and especially with sort of like George's influence, and some of the songs, they're songs at that point. They say, you know, I am you and you are me, we are one, all together, yeah, we are all one. And so the idea sort of that is based on that sort of, you can see how the ideas of Hegel can very, very easily be this sort of it's called monism. It's called everything sooner or later is going to be reconciled in one. The relations that you have between objects in the universe are internal relations. So what apparently individual thing in the world is actually related internally. There's actually some fundamental for the want of a better term, sort of spiritual level, there's a oneness. But you know, many people say it's not even a spiritual thing. They would actually say it's a physical level. The separation, our apparent experience as individuals is illusory, and there's a oneness to reality. So I think Bertrand Russell, when he was trying to express the difference between his view, or the analytical view, and the Hegelian view, because he said that he abandoned in the 1890s the teachings of Hegel, because he said he was a weak Hegelian in the early part of his career in the I'm not sure when that was, perhaps 1870s, 1880s, and but you know, he had the real the dramatic turnaround when Moore, G. Moore, is considered the person that his method, Moore's method, his analytical method, led to a big revival in analytical philosophy, and for many at that time a rejection of Hegelianism, the various forms of Hegelianism, and the various interactions with idealism. So what is analytical philosophy? So in a sense, Russell tried in those big terms. He was saying the difference between our view as analysts of the universe and Hegel's view is that he said, I see the universe as like a pile of buckshot. They're basically that's sort of like pellets. So they're all pellets piled up on the counter. And he says, whereas Hegel sees it as like a sticky bunch of molasses in honey. So everything sticks together. So the whole, if you like, reality is all interconnected. Whereas analytical philosophy says is that they're separate, distinct entities, and they are in a relation to one another. So we're in a relation. We are distinct objects, but we have a relation with one another, and that's the base. That's really the core of analysis. At the core of the analytical tradition, despite all its differences, there's many people doing analysis, and they come to totally 100% contradictory conclusions, and they fight with one another as analysts. But the analytical method, the analytical philosophy, has as its assumptions that there are individual entities and that they are in a relation to one another. Some people might call this, in epistemology, you would call this externalism. That there's what your relationship to knowledge, your relationship to the targets of knowledge knowledge is not something that's coming from some sort of. It doesn't require any internal. Like I feel, I touch, I smell, it can be something that's totally external. You can still know something, but it's external to you. It's because you've encountered it at some point, perhaps in the past, or you've accepted it on some other basis. It doesn't require any first person involvement. So that's the thing. So analysis really is talking about a world of external objects. There's external objects out there. Those objects are really out there. That's what you might call realism. The objects are really out there, and that we're in relationship to those objects. And even more so, we have access to those real objects. There's not like this Kantian distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal. So we're almost over the threshold of actually getting it properly into analysis. So, excuse me, I'll get a little drink here. actually did sketch something here of the different themes that I wanted to try and include, to make sure I included. The greatest change, in the sense that what really made modern analysis possible was that in the 1850s and 1860s there was somebody called, I would call him Gottlieb Frege. I think his full name something like Friedrich something Gottlieb Frege, but he's known as Gottlieb Frege, known as Frege, and he was like he innovated and made some discoveries in logic, or which paved the way for the analytical mode of thought. Because logic, the theme of the role of logic is primary in any. It's interesting. We tend to not appreciate the significance of logic, the different logics, and how they help in the construction of knowledge, and the implications of actually understanding what we say, and understanding that there's logical relations between the different objects in the words or signs and sentences. So amazingly, until the middle of the 19th century, logic had been dominated by Aristotle, and basically Aristotelian sort of like logical concepts, or things were considered Aristotelian, not necessarily just what Aristotle wrote, but the medieval scholastic period. They used the ideas of Aristotelian logic, and so and some of those thinkers, like people like Duns Scotus, phenomenal thinkers. People don't understand that just because they were monks and members of monastic communities that they weren't thinkers. They were, and that's part of the prejudice when people don't really understand these guys were thinkers. Duns Scotus particularly was an amazing thinker, and you've got Aquinas and but their assumptions and their logic, and when they used logic, was very much, they were still Aristotelian in their ideas. And for Aristotle, a declarative sentence, in the sense logic was limited to declarative sentences, and with a declarative sentence, you've got, say, a subject term and a predicate term. So say the mat is green. So your subject is the mat, and is, if you like, the green is green. The green is the predicate term, and all that means is that the green is qualifying in some way the subject term. So that was Aristotelian logic, is based on that relation. Now, what Aristotelian logic couldn't handle was relational sentences which express some sort of relation. So if you were saying the cat is on the mat, the on the mat there's some sort of relationship between, it's expressing a relation of the cat being on the mat, and you can't resolve that into simple subject predicate forms that you have in Aristotle's logic, because it's just not there. It hasn't got that concept of relation, and so in the sense of the logic itself was very, very limited. Now, one of Frege's, what you can only describe as absolutely revolutionary innovations, was he came up with a logic, we might call it sort of like predicate logic, first order predicate logic or something, but he came up with the quantifier, and it allowed you to express relational sentences which are expressing a relation. They're not just in subject predicate form, but they're relational, so they're expressing some sort of relation. He allowed you to recode those sentences that we write in English or German. He was German, so he'd be writing in German. But whatever language you right, if you translate that into logical symbols, then it doesn't matter then what's that sentence is actually expressing. Any logician could look at those symbols and actually understand what you're expressing, and that was incredibly powerful, that change in the ability of logic, because what that led to was people would say that if you can express in clear logical description particular sentences, that perhaps the philosophical problems that we have are actually to do with the fact that our language is ambiguous. And this is one of the assumptions of analysis, is that philosophical problems are result because of language and because of the ambiguity in language. So the first phase of analytical philosophy was to try and discover this perfect, if you can read code, all your, if you like, signs, your sentences, your words, your propositions, in this perfect logical language, then the problems of philosophy will either be resolved, or they'll become clear and allow you to come up with solutions. So this was the first phase of the analytic movement, which was this perfect language. This is very much associated with Carnap. He published this Aufbau, which is like the logical structure of the world. So it's like his Bible, almost. It's his definitive statement of his philosophy. But that's very much that's what its subtitle in English is, the logical structure of the world. And so it's very much based on this idea of Frege that with using these new tools of this logic, which is far more powerful, the logic of the 20th century, the different logics that have flown out of that. There was almost no progress in logic for two millennia, and then suddenly in the last 120 years there's been a lot of work in logic and different, there's been other logics which have come out, which logic is all about establishing proof systems, and most of them are. I mean, you do get some strange, interesting logic like fuzzy logic, and because in classical terms you would consider something is A or something is B. The law of excluding middles, it can't A or B. Things cannot be both A and B at the same time. Some people look at, say, quantum mechanics and consider that actually some famous experiments are the double slit experiment, where two things might seem to be in two places at the same time, and so you get so some people flowing out of that say, there's a fundamental indeterminacy and subjectivity in reality, and that's definitely something to consider in a future talk, because if I go off on that, it's such an interesting thing. It's something I put in my book. Again, all these videos, blow my own trumpet for a few minutes, all these videos are connected with stuff which I'm trying to advertise, in a sense, themes which are in the book, and trying to advertise philosophy. So this is, in a sense, to try and introduce you to my thought and where it's going, to try and hopefully you think, actually, even though I don't understand very much of what he said, actually I really want to find out more. As the book's just gone to the typesetter, so the publisher's done all the check, it's gone to the typesetter, but they're saying worst case it might be July of next year before I actually have physical printed copies, but it's in the process of being published, so it's great. Really pleased with that. Passed the format check. They were complaining about the formatting of the bibliography, even though their house style doesn't match any of the other normal styles. They've got about 50 styles in Word, all these different bibliography styles. Doesn't match any of them. It was a strange sort of hybrid style. It's actually quite interesting, because they said, you follow the Chicago model for all your formatting of your text. If you've ever written a book, the Chicago manual style. So there's all these different typographical conventions and when to use certain length of dashes, and if you've got British or American punctuation rules, well, man, I tell you, it's been fun. But this is all connected with themes and stuff which are in the book. But let's try and get back to Frege. Now, another thing which Frege, one of his amazing innovations was that he said that a concept is like, a unsaturated, because he was a great mathematician, and so that was his interest. He believed that you could derive mathematics, pure mathematics, from logic. And now that one of the great sort of one of the great controversies in the philosophy of mathematics and is the status of mathematics, and the status of whether mathematics is just a set of rules which we agree on, say axioms which are agreed on, which are unprovable, but we assume them, and then we develop systems of thought that spring out of those axioms. And that's one view of mathematics. Plato's view of mathematics was almost like it was those objects of numbers that they're existing somewhere else in this, Plato's theory of forms. They're in another realm, and so and what we have in this realm, mathematics was almost. I've heard this quite a few times, that people describe how mathematics is like the thoughts of God. So mathematics had this mystical Platonic. There was lots of mystics who looked at the beauty of mathematics, and the mathematics being the language of nature, and there's all sorts of mathematical relations in nature, and when you pull a string tight, that's the basic of music, isn't it? The higher the tension and the narrower the string, the higher the pitch. And when trees grow up, trees you get ones which are like spirals, and you get other ones which are almost like they're what's called binomial growth. And so you get these different that seem to be this perfect these mathematical relations in nature. And so people are saying, well, because they're in nature, because we see them, they can't just be conventions. They can't be just arbitrary conventions or axioms. There's something real about mathematical objects. And number, the concept of number, because they're one of the first people to try and address in the 19th century. There's somebody called John Stuart Mill, who was very, very famous for his political philosophy, but he was one of the he wasn't a logical empiricist, but he was an empiricist, or somebody who was very interested in empiricism, and an empirical view of number. So he's saying, well, actually all numbers are generalization, inductions from our experience. So the number 3, because we have 3 physical things, that's all they are. But somebody instantly points out, well, the concept of rationals in maths, like pi's like the ratio between the diameter and the circumference of a circle is the number pi, and it's an irrational. And what that means is 3.1457259. It's an infinite progression of numbers. Whatever, I might have gone wrong after the first. At one point, I'd have probably been able to quote about 30 decimal places, but not now. But most people. But it's like it. Though that doesn't have any obvious material analogue. You wouldn't. Whereas what Mill was trying to do was offer an empirical theory of number, but it's woefully inadequate. But the amazing thing about what Frege did was that Frege, by asserting that it was based on logic, there's nothing mystical about that. These are just, until you have to justify what your logic is. Why? Because logic in many ways doesn't fit into a materialist view of the universe, does it? You don't go out and look and find a logic out somewhere. Logic is thought, is a pattern of thought. But what was amazing for him is it was saying that assuming that by saying he was that's what's called logicism. Actually, is when you believe that mathematics can be derived from logic. The work of Russell and Whitehead in their Principia Mathematica, in which that they published together, that was meant to be a thorough working out of, from some basic logical principles, the foundation of mathematics, which has an enormous consequence if you can demonstrate that mathematics is derived from just a few foundational logical principles. It immediately gets rid of this mysticism and metaphysical assumption regarding mathematics if you can get it from logic. So that's why their way of work was very, very foundation and radical. But when you, even though the work was astonishingly impressive, Quine had quite a lot to say about that work. He said he was initially very much drawn to that work, but then you have remarkable figures like Kurt Gödel, and his what are they called? They're called the incompleteness theorems, which were in the middle of the 20th century, where he basically showed that you cannot prove some of the basic foundations of arithmetic. You can't generate a logical proof for some basic theorems of mathematics. And so that logicist program of saying that mathematics is merely a matter, can be derived entirely from logic, that in a sense was the refutation of that view. It turned mathematical philosophy on its head. It's probably some of the most groundbreaking work ever. And Gödel was known for his. He believed that mathematics was an expression. It's almost like a reversion to that previous view that mathematics is somehow an expression of the mind of God and of the logic of God. And so, it's not something that can be independently derived from abstract logical principles. So, that's remarkable in itself. That's a remarkable view of mathematics. So let me. I'll pause there again because I've just done another 30 minutes. So we've managed to almost get into a little bit of analysis, get into a little bit of Frege. But I want to do more on Frege because there's some of his innovations really opened the door to the analytical revolution. Hello again, welcome back to part 3 of Analytical Philosophy. Just talking a bit about Frege. One of his other amazing advances Frege made was he gave a definition of a concept. He was a mathematician, and he said that a concept is like a unsaturated function in maths. Now, if you can remember your algebra, and if you can remember sort of like y equals mx plus c, they're functions. So depending on what your value of x is, or what the value of y is, you get, for y equals mx plus c, you get your straight line graph, and c is your intercept on the y-axis. If you remember, if you're remembering any of this, and then can you remember sort of like quadratic equations as well, where you get like a curve, and where it hits, you've got like roots of the equation, and you get things like x squared plus 5x plus 6 or something, and you can use the quadratic, and you can either use an equation for that gives you the different roots depending on your values of that you put in x. But you've got specific values of x generate a specific value of y, and so, but that function, if you like, is unsaturated. When it just says, say, like 2x minus 3, you need
you need to have the value of x to generate the value of y. So if you've got, say, y equals 2x minus 3, then y is only a particular value when you put x in, and that's what you call an unsaturated function. So Frege said that concepts are like these unsaturated functions. Now, what makes them real, if you like, and what gives you a full and saturates them, what gives you a full, meaningful sentence, is when you saturate them with objects. So he's saying that, if you imagine, so take the unsaturated function discovered America. So this is a concept, discovered America. So how do you saturate that? Well, you put an object into that. You would say Columbus discovered America, and that actually, if you like, that's like a saturated function. It encapsulates some sort of proposition. It gives you, it's meaningful. And so he's saying that, so Frege's amazing innovation was, he was saying, here you have this unsaturated function, this generalization, the objects of reality are what you put in to this concept that gives it meaning and gives it concrete context. So the amazing thing about that is that he is resolving the problem of universals and particulars, because he's saying that this universal, this concept, that is the universal, and the objects of reality of the, if you like, of phenomena, which then hydrate or saturate the concept, they generate the meaningful sentence that expresses something in the real world. So it was it's a remarkably powerful model. And so he said that ability to generate that, and to reflect and to give you a reflection on saying, here are your concepts, this model of concepts, here are your concepts, the objects of reality, which are real objects. That's the thing, there are objects, they're real concrete objects, which then hydrate this unsaturated concept. They then generate meaning in the real world, and that type of logic and that explanation of you're then saying that concepts are not abstract things that do not exist, that don't exist somewhere, but they're real entities. They're something real. So this is a total contradistinction to for Hegel's idealism, or the idealistic assumptions that dominated 19th century philosophy, that real objects are generated in some way by the mind. He's actually saying, no, these concepts are not something that's inside. These concepts actually exist as unsaturated logical functions, and when you put objects of the world into them, they then generate descriptions of reality, and they denote something. And we're going to talk about sense and reference very shortly. But so that was an astonishingly powerful view. So it basically opens the doorway up to saying that if you can break down the world into its various concepts, into these little blocks which aren't saturated on themselves, they're not things that express some idea fully, like discovered America. It's unsaturated. It needs another object, i.e. Columbus, that comes into that concept of discovered America to make it meaningful, and to express something, to express a proposition, to give it a truth value. And so that is a very, very powerful tool. and it is in total opposition to the idea that you are generating, that your mind is generating those objects and constructing those objects of reality. Because no, what he's actually saying, this is like, in a sense, the total opposite to this. He's actually saying that those concepts, whatever they are, if the mind holds those concepts and the mind then encounters those objects external to itself, which are really out there in the real world, this is a very, very realistic view. The world, the concept in the mind encounters these objects, and that then those saturated concepts then give you constitute reality. And so that was such a revolution from Kant's psychologism and the psychologizing of the mind generates the objects of reality. This is total opposite. This is saying that your mind encounters those objects of reality out there as real objects, and reality has its own form, and your mind doesn't imprint a form on reality. Your mind encounters that form of reality. If you ever read Maurice Schlick, his Knowledge, I'm not sure if that's the full title, but he's generally considered one of the founders he was one of the founders of the Vienna Circle, and with himself and Carnap, they are generally considered the founders of the logical positivist movement. And he very much took that idea from Frege and actually said, and it's one of my favourite quotes, I think, in that in Schlick's work, where he says that, because he does this remarkable argument. It's very refreshing if you've been plodding along through what you might think of as I don't want to say Continental philosophy, but philosophy which is very subjective, emotive. The language is very dense, and it's sort of like, it's so sophisticated, you sort of read it and think, wow, and you say, well, what does that actually mean? And so if you've had to read quite a lot of that work, and then you read something like Schlick or Carnap or so, they're razor sharp. They're analysts, they are, in what they're actually saying, they are really going for the jugglers, and they're being very, very specific, very, very clear. And he constructs this remarkable argument through his work, and then right at the end he then just dismisses the entire Kantian thesis and says the mind doesn't impose its form on reality, because reality already has its own form. And I'm not sure I've quoted that exactly right, but I'm nearly there. And so, so your mind doesn't construct the objects of reality, which is the Kantian thesis and the post-Kantian thesis, of those people took, and still very influential in the late 20th century in the work of people like Derrida and stuff. They really, they had a different sort of like take on it, but they nevertheless used that view that your mind's constituting in some way the objects of reality, and so reality is ultimately subjective, and that has enormous moral implications, because it's not a matter of normative morals anymore. It's all to do with how you feel and subjective relations, and something might be right now that wasn't right this time last year or something. So there's enormous moral implications for that type of view. But here you have through the work of Frege, you've got this sort of like this foundation of being able to say that there's logical relation, there's a logical structure of reality, and there's a definition of what a concept is. That concept's not something abstract. You've got some sort of concrete definition of what a concept is. And the purpose of analysis and analytical philosophy is to break down what you might consider to be the complexes of reality. You break them down into units until you get to the point where they can no longer be broken down. The ultimate end of analysis is to break everything down, to make those relations clear, and to then in my view anyway, the philosophical task after that is to then synthesize. So you bring together these different external relations into some sort of coherent whole. Now, modern analytical philosophy is almost that synthetic function that's almost entirely disappeared from the analytical tradition. People have just broken things down into narrow, smaller units, and they might become great experts in one particular area as a philosopher, but they're not interested in that synthetic task of bringing stuff together. That's considered very, very old-fashioned. But the original, particularly in the work of Hume, or he explicitly says it, one of the purposes of philosophy is to give some sort of overall account of reality. And so modern analysis is almost, it's because analytical philosophy, you can divide up the 20th century in many ways into the first part, which was this amazing confidence in this idea of logic to deconstruct, for us to be able to generate this perfect language, this perfect logical language, and then by examining that perfect logical language, you can then resolve what were considered to be the problems of philosophy, with some of the paradoxes and the seeming unresolvable logic. The solutions would then emerge because you'd managed to put this into a precise logical language. So that's very much one of the assumptions of analytical philosophy, is that because the problems of philosophy are considered to be linguistic, language is imprecise, ambiguous, amorphous in our normal language. Rewrite those sentences in this perfect logical language, and then the solutions to philosophy will present themselves. That's very much, if you've ever read a very peculiar book, if you've ever read Wittgenstein's Tractatus, this is what he gets to sort of like at the end, in the final chapter. Now, in many ways, I think that the positivists, particularly Carnap, and the Vienna Circle, they embraced Wittgenstein's Tractatus as almost like their founding document. But Wittgenstein, the enormous irony of that is that Wittgenstein's conclusion was actually a mystical conclusion, and he in many ways said that because he finishes it up with those things which we cannot, of which we can speak. He actually said, well, actually, what we can actually speak about meaningfully is an incredibly small. As regarding how little have we can we actually say, and it made his conclusion is he's saying that about which we cannot speak, we should be silent. And he said what we can actually speak about, which if you like turns out to be incredibly small. And there's even more of a contradiction that runs through the Tractatus at the end, because he said, if you followed my logic to where I've actually got to, he said, it's a bit like I pulled up the ladder which I climbed up on the way up here. And he's almost admitting that this is totally self-contradictory and meaningless, and therefore we shouldn't really talk about things. But the positivists actually took because he's saying any metaphysical anything, if you're trying to make a metaphysical statement in language, i.e. you're trying to describe the fundamental makeup of reality, he said that is totally, you can't, language, that's beyond the facility of language. Now his conclusion was a mystical one. He was saying there certainly is, if you like, what we would call Kant's noumena, if we put it in Kantian terms. There certainly is another world beyond what we can express in language, but but it's mystical. It's something that you're intuiting. It's something that appears to us. It's not something that we think to or that we get to. This is something that it will appear to us in our consciousness. And so, whereas the positivist took his work and said, yes, right, that of saying that language can't express metaphysics, language cannot express metaphysical truths, language can only deal with the particulars, the atomic relations of reality, if you like, the logical atoms of reality, that they were very, very excited by his work, and that led to the logical positivist view, which is encapsulated in what was called the verification principle. And it's actually, I think Ray Monk in his, I think he's done two. I think that was, maybe it's not in Monk's biography of Wittgenstein is fascinating, and he does talk a lot about how the positivists adopted, and because Wittgenstein in they had like a symbiotic relationship in a sense. People tend to, he had an enormous influence on that movement, but that movement also influenced him. And it was only during the 30s when he started when he returned to philosophy, because he believed he totally solved the problems of philosophy with his Tractatus, and so he retired from philosophy, became a school teacher, or became a gardener, I think, in a monastery, and then became a school teacher. And then I think it was G. Moore went to visit him in Norway and persuaded him to return to Cambridge, I think in the early 20s, maybe 1921 or something. But he basically believed that his Tractatus had solved philosophical problems, because it actually says, yes, it concludes with this saying, here we are, these problems are now solved, that's it, we're finished. Then he changed his mind and actually thought, no, he doesn't. He said, because there's more, because this idea of a perfect language in the analytical tradition, that by the end of probably the end of the 1940s and with the fundamental weakness of the verification principle, which was originally called, that was what the point I was trying to get to, was that this verification principle, one of Wittgenstein's biographers, I think it was one of his students, I think the one, I think it's called Young Ludwig. I'll put the books in the description somewhere. But there's Monk's biographies are generally considered excellent introductions, and I think Monk's done he did a short introduction to Wittgenstein thought as well, which is really handy if you're trying to get the feel around this period of how important his thought was. Because some people talk about Wittgenstein and say he was totally unique in the sense that he precipitated two philosophical revolutions in his lifetime, and his second revolution where he utterly contradicted, or people say that he utterly contradicted his earlier period. Some people say there was three distinct periods in his career, in his thought, which is probably true. But I still think there's some thematic links that are all the way through his thought, and it's really his work should be considered as a body of thought. It's not his view of what words could do and his view of language and what his central commitment to the importance of language and the function of language as a form of life. It was something which I believe you can see all the way through from his idea of the work that comes directly from Frege's view of logic and atomism, all the way through this to that later work, and to hinge propositions, and there's a themes that run through Wittgenstein. I think it's a mistake to try and separate them off, other than for the purposes of teaching and analysis yourself. But you need to understand that even though he did sort of like say that he underestimated the role and the use and the types of role and the overemphasized science and the importance of science in his early work, he nevertheless still recognised that the scientific language game was a legitimate language game. But those are things to look at, I think, on their own in a future video. But wanting to fill in, there's something that Frege, another thing that Frege did, which was of profound importance, I think, to not just analytic philosophy, to be honest. There was some insight which helps just understand language and the use of language. He made a distinction between what's known as the sense of a sentence, or the sense of a word, and its referent. And the great Swiss linguist, I think Saussure, or however I pronounce that name, probably butchered the French language. He also made this very, very important distinction as well. And so they had two very different, but this incredible insight. So, real profound, deep, great consequence of this insight in helping to actually understand language. It's like you can say, for example, the bright morning star, and you can say the evening star. Now, the sense of the expression is that the bright morning star, it's the last star that's visible. As dawn comes, it's the last star that's visible. And in fact, it's not a star, it's actually the planet Venus. So Venus is the thing you see last, the first thing in the morning. It's a bright morning star, but it's also the evening star. It's the first one you see in the evening. It's actually the evening star is actually the planet Venus. And so he makes the distinction that the referent is Venus, the planet Venus, but the sense of that word there, bright morning star, that is referring to something it's referring to something very different than the reference. The reference, the thing that gives it that's the object, that's the real object that something's referring to. But in a sense, that helps define what the meaning of the sentence is. Whereas the sense of it, which is something, in a sense, the logical meaning is the referent it is referring to, the thing that gives that expression its meaning, the bright morning star or the evening star. He would say that the referent which gives it its meaning is the planet Venus. But the sense can be something very, very different. And so that distinction between the sense and the referent has enormous significance for the philosophy of language and for how language expresses a proposition. So one theory of language is that the meaning of a sentence is that a proposition expresses the meaning of the sentence. So but a sentence you can have different sentences in, it's like es ist gut, c'est bon, it is good. They're all French, German, English, but the meaning, some people would say, what that is actually expressing is the proposition, the thing that you can say is true or false. They're all expressing the same proposition. And so Frege said that the thing that the referent, if you like, is what grounds the objects of reality. And so he said that we should never admit into our dictionary of science, which basically means you can never, whatever that's naming, whatever this object, these objects are naming, as long as they've got a referent, we can admit them. If we can't establish the referent of a term in language, then we should not admit it. In other words, it's meaningless. And that theory of meaning, of the distinction between sense and reference, was again very, very influential for early analytical philosophy, because it basically said that if we can't establish as an object that's in nature a term within a sentence, then that sentence is meaningless. If we can't establish what, because you and that idea that you have to ground the objects of reality have to be grounded in some real physical object. It's called in more formally it would be called the theory of logical form, and this is very much the early Wittgenstein, and what Russell was trying to do in his logical atomism, of breaking stuff down into, yes, right, these are somehow connected with reality, and this is where you get the verification principle, which when you read young, I think it's called Young Ludwig, and it's Malcolm. I think Malcolm is was actually one of his students. I think at Cambridge during the 40s and 50s. I think it probably maybe it was even in the 30s. I'm not sure when he moved around quite a lot. Wittgenstein from he actually was briefly. I live in Newcastle upon Tyne, and he was actually at the hospital doing medical research during the I think the Second World War, because he didn't believe that philosophers were doing anything useful. So he went and did some training. He was actually apparently a very good sort of student for he was helping in the medical labs doing medical research. But then after the Second World War finished, then because I think he died quite quickly, maybe in the late 1950s or something, because he got cancer, didn't he? But he was in Oxford. But this sort of like late period, I think he'd done these lectures, and some of his students had done these lectures. But Malcolm, who was one of these students, ended up doing this biography, which is really, really interesting because he concentrates on a very narrow period of his young life, and he gives enormous insights into his relationship with Russell, and which was very, very, very formative, and how the background of the Tractatus. But one of the things he actually talks about was that what the logical positivists became famous for was their verification principle, and Malcolm actually says, well, it was actually known within the circle itself as Wittgenstein's verification principle. It was something that had come out of the Tractatus, but when Wittgenstein in a sense repudiated that, started to repudiate that work by the middle of the 30s, it then just became the verification principle, because in many ways logical positivism really came into its own when Ayer published Language, Truth and Logic, which was first published I think in 1935, which was like the first expression in the English language of logical positivism, and that really set the intellectual tenor within the academy until I think 1957, 57-58 was when Quine published his Two Dogmas of Empiricism, which was the repudiation of, that was the final death knell for logical positivism. As a movement, it disintegrated as a coherent logical movement by then, because Quine so undermined some of the central tenets of logical positivism. But for that period, it absolutely dominated the view. The idea that the verification principle basically tells you and says that unless you can tie a sentence is only, or a sentence or a proposition is only meaningful if it can be tied to the physical world. So, or it's either a tautology, so it's something like a bachelor is an unmarried male. That's what's called a tautological statement, because the word bachelor means unmarried male. So Ayer had asserted that the only meaningful classes of statements are those which are tautologies, or those which are expressing something that can be verified in the physical world. So you can go out into the world and confirm it in the world. If it can be confirmed in the world, then it's a meaningful statement. So that was a logical positivist theory of meaning, or the verification principle. And so the consequences of that is, if you think about it, is that can you go out into the world and find God? If you're, or any sort of metaphysical statement, by definition, the metaphysical statement is trying to describe reality for you. It's trying to tell you what is real, but in a priori way. It's not related to nature at all. So the logical positivists basically said that all metaphysical statements are meaningless. Every single one of them. So all religious statements, all statements about God, anything that's trying to talk about beyond what we can verify by empirical methods and by logic and tautologies and logical systems, anything beyond that, any sort of a metaphysical view is false. You cannot state, if somebody, it's like, if Wittgenstein, I think, put it a little bit like this. He said, if somebody is in their propositions, in their signs, which basically means the right senses, is purporting to talk about something metaphysical, then one needs to point out to them that they've got no, some of those signs have got no referent, which is how we connect it to Frege, and Frege opened the door for this way of looking at the world, and so the logical positivists really took that idea on in there, made the verification principle not a doorway to mystical understanding of the world, which in a sense was what Wittgenstein's purpose for the Tractatus was to say there is the mystical. His conclusion was mystical, but they in a sense took it and said the only meaningful, only particulars exist. There's no universals, only particulars exist, and those particulars are the phenomena of the natural world, and unless we can relate stuff to the natural world, all discourse is meaningless. And that is the real, that represents you then understand, in a sense, that allows you to look at that period in many ways intellectually began with the work of Darwin, and this progressive secularization and naturalization of philosophy and of the way of looking at the world, until you end up with, in the 1930s, you had what was called, I think it's called the Wissenschaft or something, and it was like the scientific view of the world. So that was the Positivist manifesto, and then at the end of the 30s you obviously got the first Humanist manifesto, and then we had sort of Nazism and Communism, and they all in their all atheistic views of the world that deny all different expressions of atheism. And so the idea that somehow we separate our philosophy and our politics from religion or from theology or from metaphysics, we can see the consequence of that, in a sense, in what happened to the world when metaphysics was rejected, and you then had this vacuum filled by these, what people called was science, because we have to remember that the Nazis were very scientific. Their view, they believed generally that they were representing some sort of scientific view and some sort of progress of the world. It's like if you dig into Nazi philosophy and they really did believe that theirs was a scientific program. The communists really, really believed that theirs was scientific socialism. You know, they weren't utopian socialism, they were scientific socialism. And so this unhooking from any type of metaphysical concepts, which was made possible because of this progress through the 19th century, and then into this logicism of Frege, and then the logical positivist view, and these all were different aspects of what are the consequences to philosophy when it becomes unhooked from any sort of metaphysical moorings. So I think I'll leave it there. But that key thing of that verification principle. I think in the next one we'll talk a bit more about that verification principle and why what Quine found was so wrong with it, because it's very even though it's remarkable to think that even though it dominated thought for dominated the academy for between 20 or 30 years, absolutely, and in many ways modern naturalism, some of the flavour of modern naturalism really got its naturalistic science got its basic views and its temperament from logical positivism. So incredibly influential view, but that principle of something's only meaningful if you can attach it to the real world and that you can verify it in some way with reference to the real world, that verification principle is a very powerful principle. You can see why it had such an appeal to people who were looking for a way of getting back to some sort of real way of being able to describe the world, not in idealistic terms, in mental, psychological terms but where you're dealing really with science and you're providing some sort of a philosophy that's far more scientific rather than speculative and amorphous and dense. We want something that's clear. That was the point of analytical philosophy, is that we're making things clear. Analysis, breaking things down, and then if we break them down into nice units, then eventually we can understand those. We then try and synthesize them back again. That was the original flow, the intention of analytical philosophy. And so, so it's like I'm an analytical philosopher, I'm an analyst. I break things down, try and understand things, and then try and synthesize stuff together. So I think, but that, getting to that sort of like point of the verification principle, seeing how powerful it is, the obvious next step is to say, well, what's the problem with it? And it actually has got like a blatant, obvious problem. And there's been some very interesting work that's in some way that's been done on to try and give the verification principle a firmer foundation, because the problem of the interaction between mind, or what's called the mind-body problem, which bothered Descartes, which has been a real issue in philosophy very much since Descartes. How do you connect the mind and the body? If the body's matter, how do the mind and the mind's consciousness, how do these two interact? How is that? Because Descartes was a dualist, wasn't he? So then other people were monists, other people were atomists. But this idea of how can we connect mind and world? Very famous philosopher called McDowell, who wrote the book Mind and World. Still, this stay the same problem. How do we? What is our relation to the objects of reality? So the analysts, their desire, their passion was to return to, say, like a real world, a world of real objects. We're not stuck in some sort of idealistic world of Kant where we're generating the objects of reality. No, we're saying we're in contact somehow with the objects of reality. Okay, so I've overrun my episode time by 10 minutes there, but I think there's so much interesting content in there. So some of these things are developing much more detail. But if it's like if you were trying to, I'm not giving a lecture here. I'm trying to sort of introduce stuff and put words out there and say, right, these are things that I dig into in more detail. But there's a great book called by Locke on analytical philosophy, which I'll also put in the description. So because I think there's probably no better. I think it's a high level reference. It's great. It's a great book. Very, very thorough. My first supervisor recommended this book to me for analytical philosophy. It's an excellent book, so I'll put that in there just to get a feel of what the differences is. But in many ways, analytical philosophers are far more scientific. So you're very much interested in sort of like it naturally goes along with with a scientific view in some sense. It's like a corollary to it. Quine's famous for describing when he talks about, because he views philosophy as part of science, as like on a continuum, that there's no, and that's one of the things I like about in Quine's philosophy, this sort of idea that, you know, it's on a continuum, that there's not this clear break between, say, science and philosophy, but because a lot of philosophers want to make a very, very clear distinction. They say that science, that, you know, that philosophy becomes science when it firms up and it gets a theory, and he's very much talking about that philosophy is part of science, and so which is very part of his holism. It's called holism. So these are all you know, that sort of stuff I really very much dig into, and I want to sort of probably do just a bit. I want to do another one on the verification principle. Hopefully that's like another episode in its own right, because there is it's very easy to see why. It's obvious really when you understand how and then the implications of that and what flowed out of that, because I think when I was doing my high level review I mentioned some of these things that flowed out of there, and if you get rid of verificationism as a principle in science, as a foundation for science, because most of the logical positivists really wanted to provide like a philosophical foundation for a new scientific view of reality. So when they called their manifesto the scientific view of the world, the reason why they were calling it the scientific view of the world was because they believed that science could solve the problems of the world. So can you see how there's this ethical dimension to this, which is one of the points I'm going to hammer home as much as I can, is that your philosophy is never divorced from the ethics of what you're doing with it. So these guys, lots of the positivists were signatories to the Humanist Manifesto, and what the Humanist Manifesto, it was concerned about the here and the now, of sorting out the problems of humanity by dealing with the here and the now, rather than talking about, you know, giving these grand metaphysical theories and these religious normative ways of behaving. We want to apply those, you know, that they were saying that's just a distraction from dealing with the main, how do we deal with the problems of humanity in the here and the now. So the Vision, Geschlafter, and the Humanist Manifesto, part of the same thing, part of that great movement within that, you know, flowing out of Darwinism into communism, into what became Nazism. Then you had the sort of like the Italian take, you know, the fascism. I think it was Mussolini himself who coined that term, fascism. But it was a variety of you know, totalitarian, of the Nazi totalitarian view, and the anti-democratic sort of that flow that came through, you know, as a reaction to the liberal democracies of the Victorian era, which were started to have their main big problems, and then people wanted to, you know, the problem is we need to be more scientific. You had that scientific flow, and you then had that great, you know, the great trauma both of the First World War and the Second World War, which, and you know, the Holocaust and what that said about the humanistic assumptions that man is basically good. How can you say that a man is basically good if you're then confronted with the Holocaust? You know, it wasn't just a Jewish Holocaust. It was any. There was many, you know, 6 million Jews that, you know, died, but then you had like I think you had like another million who were, you know, who you would call, you know, they were disabled in some way, or they were Romani, you know, the Romani in Europe, the nomadic sort of people. They were considered inferior people, you know, right? There was all this sort of this very much this eugenic assumption underneath Nazism, which wasn't just something that was in Nazism. It was something that was within the intellectual elites of Europe, they were very much, there was a very powerful eugenic move. You know, in Britain, where I'm from, there was a strong anti-movement against the eugenic society was a society, and they petitioned against sending the strongest young men who were the best breeding stock off to war to be killed, because they said that's going to affect our nation. And so it wasn't, you know, and all the scandals that we've had with when the Australians, what happened to the Aboriginal peoples, you know, the colonizers who didn't just affect, you know, instead they didn't just they considered the Aboriginal people as an inferior. They considered people of underneath average intelligence inferior, and this happened in you find all over the world this very strong, you know, people tend to be very focused on the evil of the Nazis, when really that sort of science and what we would now call pseudoscience, but those guys really believed that eugenics was a science, and they were giving expression to it in different ways. And so you see the importance of dealing with these issues in a holistic way. So as I didn't manage to cut myself off, I'll carry on for another 15 minutes, because I wanted to deal with the verification principle. So the verification principle says that unless we can verify, a statement is not considered meaningful unless we can verify it by empirical methods. It needs to be verifiable in theory in some way. There was like the harder logical positivists who said, yes, that's absolutely, we will not say that a statement is meaningful unless we can do that. But then you have a problem with certain types of hypothetical scientific statements, and so the softer ones very much wanted to mitigate that in some way and say no, that's too strict as a view. So we're going to allow that in principle we can believe that this statement, so say you made the statement like the moon is green cheese, in principle that statement is verifiable, so it's considered a meaningful statement. Now it might be really, really difficult, particularly at that time, because nobody had managed to get out, you know, get into orbit around the planet, but people said that in principle you could verify that statement. And so they were saying certain types of scientific statement are like that, or certain types of hypothetical statements in science. They would say that in order for science to progress, you have to admit that type of statement as a meaningful statement. And that is one of the big problems of the verification principle, is how do you provide a criteria that says that this statement, without being either too loose or too strict, how do you decide on what statements you are admissible as part of the verification principle? So that's one of the big problems of the verification principle, is the idea of criteria, is how do you assess? So the softer ones said, yes, we have to admit that statements like hypothetical statements like that, yes, we should be able to admit those in as meaningful statements. You then have a problem, as time went on a little bit more, you then had the problem with some, because they were saying that statements which express, because you have many uses of language which are expressing something meaningful, but you can't establish a referent for them. Like, you know, when we were talking about Frege, we can't sort of like identify any sort of like objects, but they are meaningful statements. They are expressing something, and if you consider just poetry, for example, you can't say, for the logical positivists, when Wittgenstein tried to read poetry, I think he started to read poetry of, what was his name? Because Einstein was friends with this poet as well. But he decided to read some of his poetry at one of the Vienna circle meetings. And so it was clear that Wittgenstein was trying to say that their interpretation of the Tractatus was not what he was really getting at, and so when he started reading this poetry in this otherwise, the Vienna Circle tasked themselves with cleaning up philosophy, getting rid of all this metaphysical baggage and rubbish that had come into philosophy. We just want to clear it out, be clear with what you're saying, in a sense, taking that inspiration from war with this method. Be clear in what you're saying. If you can't express clearly what you're saying, then you're not expressing anything what you're saying. But also the verification principle of saying, so your first level of clear out is be clear in what you're saying, get rid of all the rubbish. Second level of clear out is saying, right, now analyze your statements. Say, are these verifiable in the world? If so, yes, that's a meaningful statement. Is it verifiable? But when he sort of like he tried to read this poetry, Carnap sort of snapped and said, just metaphysics, So you see that if you believing in the verification principle, you're trying to push the verification principle. If you are then going to say that all the works of literature and of poetry and any type of artistic work of that, are you really going to say that it's meaningless? And so are you going to dismiss that entire? So the hard logical positivist said, yeah, absolutely. Now softer logical positivist said no. They wanted to say no, okay, because that's an enormous to just dismiss art, literature, that anything using language in a non-scientific way, and to say that it's meaningless, that anything non-scientific is meaningless, it dehumanizes and reduces human experience beyond what most people would consider. If you're into music, or if you're into poetry, or you understand that those are such a valuable thing. If you imagine a life without music, or if you imagine a world without poetry, whether you consider poetry as narrative, or some dramas, all that sort of stuff, that's all part of that's part of what makes life meaningful. If you cull that out of life, suddenly you've got it was such an absurd consequence of the verification principle that the later verificationists started saying, okay, yes, we will say, well, this has got a motive meaning or subjective meaning, but it hasn't got cognitive meaning. In other words, it doesn't give you sort of like knowledge of the world or knowledge about the world. It's just expressing something about how you're feeling, and that of course it's a massive reduction of human life, because often it's often the experience of art, the experience of music, the experience of talking to people, just enjoying people's company, the thing of sitting watching the sun go down, or watching the sun come up, or sitting on a mountain or something. Those aren't meaningless, and so this sort of principle of meaning, it was totally sort of like untenable from a point of view of a holistic philosophy of life. And that was one of the things that Quine really zoomed in on, was the demand for sort of like for holism. Now, I don't want to get into Quine here and now, but his criticism of what he called dogmatic was this he called it sort of like of reductionism, of having to all logical or linguistic things to be meaningful had to have some connection to the physical world. So he said that was dogmatic, and that's where that is where I want the finishing thought as far as verificationism, because verificationism sort of says that the verification principle, it's now, first of all, it said it's the verification principle, and so it says that anything that's not is considered non-meaningful unless we can connect it to the physical world. So can I go out into the physical world And can I find a verification principle growing in the garden? Where am I getting this verification principle from? I am not referencing that principle. It's not got a referent in a real object of nature. Remember going back to Frege, what's giving it meaning? It's not. It's when we call it a principle, what we mean is that this is something almost like a priori by definition. This is a priori. This is not something a posteriori, which is connected with nature, that we're doing it after the fact. This is what we're assuming about reality. We're saying that our language is only meaningful if we're connecting it with the world. We are assuming that as a starting point. We're saying this, what we in fact are saying, are irony of ironies for the logical positivists who wanted to get rid of metaphysics in its entirety. If you read Neurath, he said that the only thing that can disappear without a trace is metaphysics. But that is a metaphysical principle. It's incoherent. You can't go out into nature and find a verification principle or a verific growing on a tree somewhere. This is something. This is what, to his credit, and maybe why he lost his influence within the empiricist movement. This is what Bertrand Russell actually realised. He actually said that you cannot justify empiricism on empirical grounds alone. When you're saying that knowledge, if you say that knowledge of the world comes from sense data only, that statement, knowledge of the world comes from sense data only, is not something that results from knowledge that is resulting from sense data. If you get this, you'll get if you get that, then you've got it, what I'm trying to actually communicate. And so the verification principle, which is a form of empiricism, the more rigorous, the logical positivists considered themselves the most rigorous, using the work of Frege, the foundation of Frege. They considered themselves the most rigorous. They were offering what they considered a scientific philosophy, a philosophy that also grounded science itself and allowed for the progress of science. They considered themselves the most rigorous of all empiricists, but at the heart of their view is basically a metaphysical dogma. The verification principle itself, is an expression of a metaphysical dogma, and that's what Quine goes after. He is considered to have utterly obliterated the movement when he published his two dogmas of empiricism, I think in 1957-58, and that's why I spend quite a lot of time on my thesis, and obviously in the book, which is based on the thesis. I dig around. There's quite a lot of Quine that I dig around and look and what a bit more closely at the two dogmas, and what. One obviously is reductionism, which is reducing everything in the world to having some sort of physical analogue. But he's basically saying that that's a metaphysical dogma. The paradox of the ironies of ironies is that logical positivism was based on a dogmatic foundation rather than what they were saying, which was like a scientific foundation. They just adopted a metaphysical dogma to generate their system. So that's a great sort of thought to. This happens again and again in philosophy, because when Bertrand Russell actually, when he's reflecting on this, and he was saying, I'm considering this. I think he wrote an essay which is in one of his more obscure collections, but it's called Logical Positivism, and he discusses the positivist movement. And obviously he was a founding member of that movement, and he was in the Vienna Circle. But when Hitler came to power in Germany, because a lot of these guys were Germans, they left the US, and they left Europe, and they ended up in the different American universities. So the homogeneity, if you like, the coherence of the movement disintegrated, but there was a lot of the different American universities became centres of this thought. A lot of the people, like Carnap was at UCLA, and they basically became dispersed throughout the American universities. So there was still a lot of positivistic thought. Or when Quine, who was an intimate collaborator with Carnap, who was one of the founding members of the positive movement, when Quine published his two dogmas, he really that represented the end of, because the movement in itself, the Vienna Circle, had fragmented, but Quine represented the end of it as an intellectual movement of a stream of philosophy. Ayer did his best until I think he wrote another compendium. I think he was still 1968. I think he wrote a compendium of logical positivist thought. But Ayer by that point had recognised the limitations of the view, and even though there are amazingly there's still some who argue for a verification principle, and there is a very interesting take on the verification principle that results from the work of McDowell in his Mind and World, and some people have tried to justify the verification principle as a transcendental rather than as a empiricist principle. They're trying to justify it as a transcendental principle, so which would in a sense legitimize it. Now that's almost where I ended when I was discussing this when I discuss it in my book, when I summarise some of the work, because one of the objections to transcendental arguments is that in order to connect conceptual how you think about the world with the way the world really is, the transcendentalist would have to, Stroud said that the transcendentalist would have to import in some form of verification principle, because it's one thing to have to be for it to be logically necessary to think about the world in a particular way, but it's another thing to say that it's logically necessary that the world is actually that way. And so he was saying that transcendentalism still has this problem. It has to import in some form of verificationism for it to connect our concepts with the real world. Now, some have argued that coming out of McDowell's work, that there was a transcendental derivation of the verification principle. There's some sort of justification for it, which would mean that it's not a dogmatic or axiomatic starting point like it was for the logical positivists, but it's something that's derived as transcendentally necessary, which is obviously very, very, which would be a profound resurrection of the verification principle. But verificationism, which is favoured by it had in some philosophy of religion, there's a big anthology by someone called what are they called? I will put it in the description, but it's a very popular anthology, and it has an article by Michael Martin, who was a very energetic atheist. He wasn't like he was a little bit more sophisticated than the new atheists, Dawkins and Dennett and Harris, and when you remember, I think I mentioned one. I remembered, I was trying to think who the four horsemen of the apocalypse, but I remember three of them now. It's Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and someone else who I would have to look. But they were very, very crude, very, very aggressive atheist fundamentalists. Michael Martin was more like someone who's a bit more sophisticated. He was still quite crude and in some of his thought, but he's a tenured professor. But he was somebody that, even though verificationism is considered philosophically in disrepute, he was somebody that nevertheless was prepared to argue for a form of verificationism when he was discussing belief in God. So, which was amazing, really. It is again. It's an irony is that you get a lot of aggressive atheist intellectuals who want to who in the sense who only because they're writing and discussing philosophy of religion, they actually they're earning their keep by arguing with philosophers of religion. I find it supremely ironic that you're trying to dismiss God by talking about God. So, but that again, you see a connection between your metaphysics, your epistemology, and your ethics, and how you live your life. So, okay, so I think I'm getting a bit hoarse, so I'll chop this into two different bits. So there's three. It's just I think it's a nice overview in the sense of analytical philosophy. Just to summarise, comes out of there were analytical philosophers early on, like I say, people like Hume. Hume was an early analyst. So there were early analysts, but it disappeared after Kant. Kant, in many ways, it was like that was the idealists really came out of Kant and the Hegelians and interpretation of Kant. If you weren't an intuitionist and you wanted to revise rationalism, but with the work of Moore and the Frege sort of put with his work of mathematics, philosophy of mathematics, opened up a new way, a non-Hegelian view, and in fact in opposition to Hegel. That was picked up by Russell. Moore and Russell argued. Moore gave us a rigorous analytical method. Be clear with what you're saying, how you're saying it. If you can't be clear, then you're not talking. We need to get units of clarity. So that was the first phase of analytical philosophy, was be clear about what you're saying. And then the second phase, which we haven't really talked about much, maybe we should actually, maybe I can manage another 20 minutes to sort of talk about the second phase. When people, first of all, that logical positivist, early logical positivist, they were really emphasising the perfect, the idea of being able to use the logic of Frege, decode normal language into this perfect, refined language that would then generate solutions to philosophical problems. Now, if you read any of Carnap's attempts on this, when you read some of his sort of early work where he's talking about semines and it's hard work, and Carnap is probably the person that really pushed that sort of like idea. He's like his Aufbau, the logical structure of the world. He was one that really was the one that really tried to take that work on, tried to build on the logical atomism of Russell and Wittgenstein. He really tried together, but it failed. There's no doubt about it. It failed. The idea that you can render normal human language as this perfect, logically pure language expressing these perfect propositions. That failed. Now the second, perhaps more interesting, and whereas logical positivism sort of like crumpled under the criticism of Quine, Wittgenstein was very, very interesting, because during the 30s he was starting, his view of language and the way language worked started to change very dramatically. And by the end of after the Second World War, after that hiatus when he was doing research, and he went back into philosophy again, he started to talk about that the meaning of a language, this is I think one of the most profoundest insights of the 20th century, which is why it was such a revolutionary thought, was that he said that the meaning of a language, rather than trying to derive it from some sort of logicistic base like Frege and the logical positivists, that rather than trying to derive it from that base, he was saying that the use of a language, what gives a language meaning, it says that meaning is defined by its use. within a community. That's what gives it the meaning. And so that gave rise to what, so rather than trying to generate this perfect logical language, the second phase of the analytic philosophy movement was very much concerned with how the language, it was called, in Wittgenstein's, when Wittgenstein was the movement that when he was at Oxford, it became the Oxford Ordinary Language Philosophers. So because he was connected with Cambridge, but the Oxford school that took on his work and were influenced by his work, they became they were, for whatever reason, associated with Oxford, and there were ordinary language philosophers like Austin and Ryle, and people that are very interested, who were very much influenced by his view of language and language being defined within a community. Because one of the things Wittgenstein would say, well, when we in ordinary language talk about time, what time, well, which time we're going, what time you're going to be there, he said that there's no problem with understanding what you mean, but he said for some reason when philosophers say what is time, it suddenly becomes really, really complicated. And so he said that so in the second phase of the the ordinary language philosophers, the thing that drove them was that if we just concentrate on the way language is used, then we just clarify in the sense and understand how the language is being used, and then we can clean it. Then we can clean it up just by we can make it clear with our how the language is actually being used. And so that's what's called a therapeutic. It was the therapeutic view of the purpose of philosophy. So philosophy is nothing to do with. In fact, philosophy can't. In that view, philosophy can't really solve any sort of problems. All it's doing is making it clear what the problems are, and then delegating the solution to any of those problems to perhaps thinkers or politicians or cultural intellectuals or the different domains of human life. They're just making it clear, well, these are the problems that you need to solve. Because what they were saying that is because the ordinary language, in the sense, cloaks it, or because of the community's use of language, it can be difficult to see what the actual problem is. And so the flow that came out of that, the use of sort of like and the use of the ordinary language, that ordinary language movement, its central thing was to clarify. Now there is, alongside that, there was also people like Ryle who they had a little bit more of a transcendental flavour to their philosophy. So they were saying that when you look in language and you look at the way it's used, when you use the word good, the only reason you understand what the word good means is because you got the reference of it being bad, or vice versa, bad is good, or right and wrong. And he was saying these things, that was what he called polar opposites. So he's saying that within the structure of language itself, you've got this polar opposites, and this is what helps to give language its meaning. And so those also flowed out of that movement. And it became, and when I know I've mentioned in a previous video, when in the 1960s, when Strawson took on he started to argue intentionally in a transcendental way, neo-Kantian. So he took some of those insights of that period, and then came, in a sense, had presented like a revised Kantianism, which was quite ironic, really, in the sense of, the analytical tradition once was concerned so much, right, let's clear out this language, get rid of this Kantian nonsense, clear out philosophy, get rid of this metaphysical baggage. 1950s come. Oh no, we can't get rid of we can't get rid of metaphysics. After all, metaphysics has got a role to play. And as soon as you allow the role to play, and as soon as the logical positivists were discredited as incoherent and actually based on metaphysical dogma, you then have the reintroduction of metaphysics and a role for metaphysics in science. Now, a scientific metaphysics, I will do something on this sort of relation between science and metaphysics and what science does to meta, and a respectable. How do you make metaphysics respectable? Because if you remember Hume's great thing, his great dismissal of metaphysics, saying any of these cast into the flames, any of these books, have they got anything, no number in? No. Have they got any scientific reasoning in? No. Have they got, well, just chuck them all in the fire, in the flames. He was a librarian as well, so it was like all these books of school metaphysics, all this religious nonsense, chuck it in the fire, burn it all up. And yet now you have to, you know, this metaphysics is somehow being no, you can't dismiss it. No, it's not. So, you know, how Quine's naturalism and the naturalism that flowed out of this, what role and what place has meant? How can metaphysics have a place in a scientific philosophy? And that's something we, you know, I'll study. We'll dedicate a video looking on that, in a sense of issues within the philosophy of science, and how, you know, what does metaphysics do? You know, what metaphysical issues are still important within science, and so you can see. So, you know, we're progressing on with the sort of like with the idea that philosophy and science, they're not. You mentioned a bit that they're not separate, they're not distinct. They're part of the same. They're part of the same discussion. They're part of the process of human knowledge, and that's why I call, you know, my work epistemological self-conscious, because knowledge, theory of knowledge, epistemology, theory of knowledge, unless you can see how all these parts fit together and remain coherent, and you're not ending up contradicting yourself a little bit further down the road. A lot of problems with philosophy, when you look at people's commitments and they say, well, this is what I'm committed to, but if you follow out their commitments, they contradict themselves a bit further along. That's called the problem of coherence in philosophy, does your metaphysics fit with your epistemology, what you assume about reality and the objects of reality, and then in your theory of the world, are they consistent with your ethics? If you're not, you know, we all have the problem of being able to live consistently with our knowledge, but we would nevertheless say, oh well, but I'm aware of how they should fit together. And whereas part of the flavour of modern philosophy has been there is no way of fitting together, there is no rhyme, there is no reason, everything's subjective and everything is relative. I can just make my own way. Very much the spirit of existentialism. There is no public answers to any problem. The only answers I'm going to have to any problems are going to be private ones. I need to live my life the way I want to live my life. The only problem is we have things called governments and globalists and transhumanists and everything, who, if you don't, they will live their life for you. You will be eventually living life. If there is a place in their wonderful new utopia, they are going to be choosing how you live your life. You're not going to be living your life the way you want to live your life. You know, remember something I said in one of the first, I think maybe my first video, was that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for everything. So you need to have some sort of coherent philosophy that allows you to tie those things together, that gives you some foundation. Okay, so so thank you very much. That's nice. That gives me, you know, a shorter 20-minute roundup of the because I'll split this one into 3 bits. Okay, but that was just an introduction to analysis and the analytical tradition. And in contrast to the continental tradition, I will put a couple of references for people who are interested in the continental, because that's not my area of expertise. And unless I do some refresher reading and some listening with regards to that, I wouldn't be able to present anything vaguely to the level to try and help people understand what continental philosophy is all about. But there's a couple of great introductions to continental philosophy, because that's such a broad brush. It's a bit like analytic philosophy. It's such a broad term, but they are two very distinct ways of looking at the West within the Western tradition, in addition to yet another completely different way of the what we would call Eastern philosophy. But we saw in people like Schopenhauer and other people like, say, Jung, the psychologist Jung, how they were influenced by Eastern thought and their thought. So we need to understand that even when we say Western and Eastern philosophy, we're still using big broad brushes, and we don't understand that these are cross-pollinated each other. You know, in Arabic, the Arabic philosophers had read Aristotle, and they had a particular take on Aristotle, and there was this interchange between there's this interchange between different philosophical traditions. So we although Western and Eastern are useful as generic terms, just as analytical and continental are useful as for terms of sort of like understanding some ideas. As you dig down and as you bury, and it's not as simple as sometimes that's in the sense when you start to analyse in the analytic way of philosophy itself. You break it down into different bits. You see, it's not they're not neat categories. People have been influenced by some of the people who are enormously influential in, say, in the British empiricist tradition and in the 19th century. People like John Stuart Mill, he wrote the book On Liberty, which is one of the greatest statements of political philosophy ever. You know, it's a foundational. It's something everybody should read. But the idea that people have natural rights and that the government, his starting point was that the government should be involved to the people should be allowed to do what they want to do with a minimum interference from government. He starts from that point of view that government should be minimised. How do we justify allowing government to do more? You know, it's a foundational document within, you know, one of the most important books ever written with regards to there. But he was known as an empiricist, and his father was one of the founders of the utilitarian movement. Friedrich Bentham, the great utilitarian movement, people who were very considered very scientific, very rationalistic, very, they were influential figures in changing the world. But he said that he was personally influenced very much by some of the English Romantic poets, and so you don't, and you think, well, what was it about the Romantic poets that expressed itself in his work? And so it's like it's so useful, and so it's so important that when we're trying to understand our world and understand our society, understand our politics, and the people who are very influential within our culture, what were their influences? Why, where we end up now is a result of the philosophies that have preceded us, and of the values and the principles and the ethics that flow out of that. So philosophy is about life and living life. Okay, so Father, in the name of Jesus, lots and lots and lots of thoughts and flow of consciousness today. Lord, anybody that reads it, anybody that listens, anybody that's provoked a study, I pray this would be a rich source of inspiration for people, that they can want to read and want to study and move on in philosophy. Think about life rather than just exist. Amen. Okay, so God bless. See you again soon. Hi, good afternoon. It's Dr. Michael McNeil here. As you can see, I've just been doing yard work and chopping wood, cleaning the house, and I was listening to a series, a philosophy series, tape by Dr. Greg Bunton, History of Philosophy series, and it was really interesting because he was talking about analytical philosophy in the history of philosophy, and he talks about Frege. And I think the last series which I've done, which I'll stick this on as a postscript, I was talking about Frege and its importance, and when he presents it, he presented it quite formally, quite concisely, which I think some of the ways when I was describing it, I was sort of breezing past some things which if you were trying to understand it for the first time, you just wouldn't get there. I'm sort of like assuming quite a lot of knowledge, and so the way he put it in, I think it's quite helpful for me to sort of try and formalise, because Frege really was what his innovations in logic and his understandings of which gave rise to a distinct philosophy of language modelled after mathematics, really is the background, particularly to the analytic turn, and other philosophers in the analytical movement have moved away from the centrality of sort of logic, but I really wanted to try and formalise in a bit clearer way Frege's contributions for us to understand how important it was to get away from sort of like the subjectivity of idealism and that sort of like feel that flowed out from Kant, where we had made that with Kant as the turning point of Western philosophy, out from Kant had flowed a subjective route, an intuitive route, and in a sense the analytic turn was an attempt to get back to try and rediscover some sort of objectivity, some sort of contact with the real world. So, and Frege was so significant. So, at various points, I would stop the series and go write down some notes and then put it back. And so, it's amazing what you can do. And when you put your mind to it, you can do your housework and all your stuff and write notes. So, and prepare for going away, because I'm away next week, sort of for work. So one of the statements he makes is that one of, if you like, Frege's posits, which he works out, a posit is something which it's a bit like in normal language it's like it might be sort of like what you're going to try and prove. You think you believe this is true, and you are then going to try and work it out. So a posit. Yeah. So that's all a posit is. But it says the logic of our signs, which is basically the way we speak and write, gives us access to the objects of reality which we encounter directly. So the logic for science, our language and how we write, and contains the objects of reality which we encounter directly. So you can see how that's 100% opposite to the idealists that had flown out, interpret Kant, that say that our minds construct the objects of reality. Can you see the importance of this? The objects of reality are not things that have been constructed in the mind, they're things that we encounter. And his posit is that the logic of our signs, the way we actually speak and talk and when we write, that contains the objects of reality, and we encounter those objects directly. So that's a beautiful distillation, I think, a real clear distillation of what Frege's entire logical program is what he was wanting to prove, and I believe he worked through, and he did establish a lot of what he set out to prove. So he took mathematics as a paradigm of knowledge. Well, what does that mean? Well, a paradigm is sort of like is your governing. It's like a principle that it believes is sort of like applicable in all the other areas. So when you're trying to establish people are trying to establish, after Descartes, people were trying to establish, what do we need to do what do we need to assume in our philosophical system to build a foundation for knowledge? Because that Descartes is considered the beginning of modern philosophy, because he brought that question of how can I be certain? What can I be certain of? How can I reconstruct my knowledge? And so that's why it's such an important question. So he's saying that the paradigm for him was that mathematics is the paradigm of knowledge, and we talked about that. And he was saying that if we look at the logic within mathematics and mathematical science and how maths is done, the perfect language, if you like, mathematics, then that is generally applicable in philosophy. And by constructing a language based on those logical principles, i.e. the perfect language, remember the first phase of analytical philosophy was this perfect language approach. If we can generate this perfect language, we can Russell's posit was if we can generate this perfect language of all the other problems of philosophy, then the solutions will present themselves. We can solve the problems of philosophy as linguistic problems. When we talked about concepts are like Frege believed that concepts when they were like functions, they're equivalent to mathematical functions. So we said that mathematical functions, basic algebra, y equals mx plus c. In order to know what the value of y is, you need a value of x. And, that's so. And arguments have to go into those mathematical functions. The value of y gives you a value of x. And he said that more formally, those objects of the world, real sensible objects, come into concepts, and they generate they give us meaningful sentences. So his great contribution there is that concepts are something real. They're non-sensible, how did he put it here, non-sensible entities independent of our thoughts about them. So they're not sensible in the sense they're part of the physical world, but you consider these are nevertheless real entities, and that's such a radical. And they're not something that exists in the mind, but they are nevertheless real. So they're not sensible, they're not generated in the mind, but they exist independently of our thoughts about them. So that's like that's a radical innovation, because we tend to think when we think when we conceptualize something, we instantly think we're thinking about them, and that's how that's just a normally released use to sort of like the word concept. But where do those concepts actually exist? He's saying that these concepts are mathematical, and are like mathematics, that we can use the paradigm of maths to say, well, it's like a function. A concept like this function where the objects of the world come in, and then we generate, when they come in, we generate something meaningful, we generate a declarative sentence. If you look at, say, like what are the objects of mathematics? Well, the objects of mathematics are basically number. It's a theory of number. And so you think, well, what is a number? And so we tend to think, I write the number 2 on the board. No, you're writing the numeral 2, which represents something about the concept of 2ness. Do you see the difference there? Because otherwise, when you rub the 2 off the board, you're getting rid of 2ness out. You're getting rid of 2 in the 2ness in the universe. And he wanted to say these weren't like some of the empiricists, like I mentioned J.S. Mill, tried to say that mathematics was just conventional, and they're like inductive generalizations, so just something that happens from our experience, and we generated these rules of maths. And Frege said, no, that's nonsense, because that doesn't account for irrational numbers, what are called irrational numbers in maths, which are things like numbers like pi. And so, and he didn't say it was just like, it's got like formalism as if we're just agreeing that something's so. He's actually saying, because this is conceptual and you actually generate something meaningful, it's not just formal, it's something much more it's much stronger than just being something formal. Just we're agreeing on maths, we're agreeing axiomatically about maths. He said there's something much stronger. So he's giving an actual account of a concept being filled with objects of the world that are generating a completely meaningful declarative sentences. And so we've got here that he said those are like the predicates of a sentence. So, and when you predicate something, you are, if you like, you're describing something. So if you like, say, like the house is red, then the house, which is the subject, redness is being predicated of the house. So the is red is like the predicate. So discovering America is like a predicate, and in order for it to be complete, you have to have the object of reality, which is what when this model becomes so powerful, your object of reality. So, i.e., Columbus discovering America, and the house is red. So the house is the real object that hydrates the concept. So you see how powerful this is, because you're saying that you're giving a universal. It's enabling, say, for there to be universal and for there to be a particular. So it's giving a definition of that probably the oldest problem in philosophy. How do you reconcile universals and particulars? And so you're able, by this model of concept being hydrated by an object that instantiates a particular. So it's a very, very powerful model. That's why his contribution is so radical. And he was saying that yes, the objects, when you saturate like a sentence, saturate a concept, and you create like a declarative sentence, that's what you would call a proper name of our grammar. So we tend to think of proper names like nouns, don't we, in sentence? But he's saying that a proper name, what you actually name as a proper name are those hydrated concepts. And he goes on later to say that we shouldn't admit into our dictionary a proper name unless we can establish a referent. And we made that distinction, didn't we, between sense and referent. And because we looked, say, we used the example of Venus, which is the morning star and the evening star. So, and Venus is the referent, if you like. Venus is the, it's a nice formal definition here, so it's the object picked out by any expression. So it refers to the actual object that's picked out by the expression. So whereas the morning star is referring something much broader, it's the thought it expresses. So when you say the morning star, what you actually really mean is you mean that it's the first it's the last star that you see in the morning before it gets too bright, and it's the first star you see in the evening. So you see it, that's the thought, that's the if you like, what that's actually signifying. That's quite different, or that idea of meaning, or is very different from basing meaning on it saying being the referent. Normal language, we can use phrases such as say the will of the people. That doesn't have any referent. That doesn't pick out or identify any single object, but it still expresses a thought. So you can see there that that you can actually say things in ordinary language, and often we call them idioms. We say things in ordinary language which are meaningful to us. We might say something like the round square is happier than the rectangular square, and so each of those items, it's like it's got a meaning, but it doesn't signify anything, and it doesn't identify any sort of referent. It's like you can see that you could have these. your signs, if you abuse the logic of your signs, which is what I just did there, he would say you're not naming anything at all, and so you shouldn't allow, that is not a proper name, you shouldn't allow it into your system of signs if you want to signify and to be connected with the real world. So you can see how important it is for his logic. That's why he's saying don't admit anything in. If you want to be exact and you want to generate and to be clear and to be signifying the real world in some way, then don't allow that type of construction into your language. And that's when we talked about the logical positivist picking up on that thought, Wittgenstein picking up on that thought, and this is the background to it. He's saying don't allow anything that you can't establish the referent of, and don't name anything as a proper name. Allow it into your dictionary. If you want your language, if you want your philosophy to reflect the objects of the real world in some way. So I think you can see the enormous power of what he was trying to do there. He was trying to be very, very clear by saying, if you're very, very clear in your language and you understand and you use, if you like, the model of mathematics and move it into philosophy, then you're going to solve these philosophical problems. So that was what the whole of Russell's Russell took that as, if you like, his founding principle, and in many ways the logical positivists did as well, was to try and use the tools of this new logic to solve philosophical problems. Okay, so sorry it's just a little bit all over the place, but I just wanted to try and be a little bit more formal, come up with those words, come up with those formal definitions, and you can see, right, this is why this was so influential as we went into the 20th century, and why the analytic movement really got off the ground when looking at language is the most important thing. Okay, so God bless, see you next time.